Without wasting any time, let's take you to this live event now, the 20th annual Nelson Mandela Lecture.
Just bring it a little more. Thank you. I need to see you. Good afternoon. Mrs. Gracia Michelle, or shall I say Mama Gracia? Premier Nomuso, I feel as though I know you already. Leaders of government, all, traditional leadership that is present, members of the Mandela family, members of the Zuma family, my friend who last hosted me 20 years ago on my last trip to South Africa, Mr. Trevor Emmanuel and his wife. Can I just simply say Prof now? And of course, the other members of the Board of Trustees of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and Salo, I can call you that in front of everyone now too. Some may say that it is because I haven't quite been able to get the Hossa click, and if they say so, they're correct. But let me say good afternoon to all of you, and to say truly what a distinct honor and privilege it is to be here today. I want to salute our very own young Barbadian student, Oleta, who stood earlier, and her mother. You will forgive me if I feel a little old because her mother was in school with me. It is a recognition of the passage of years. But let me start by saying how honored I am this afternoon. I truly consider this one of the privileges of my life. And I say so with all humility, because there are few people who I believe have stood out as a moral colossus on the global landscape. And Nelson Mandela stood as one of those men. The truth is that I'm distinctly honored as well to be here in KwaZulu-Natal. The Premier has already laid out why this location today is also special. Special for her as the first Premier of this province, special for me as the first female Premier of this province, I should say, special for me as the first woman leader of Barbados, special because in a very real way, this marked the red line in the sand given the arrest of Nelson Mandela in this province. But special also because it is the home of Mahatma Gandhi, who is equally in that pantheon of global heroes who have inspired us to a higher and better purpose in all that we do. I do not believe that anything is therefore by accident. And then, to that extent, I do not believe therefore that the message is inappropriate, ill-placed, or ill-timed. For to be here in this place at this time to speak to this matter of justice and solidarity is, in my view, one of those things that can perhaps be viewed as preordained. The battles have been long. The battles have been strong. And one of the things that I've come here today first to have in a discussion is a lot of, as I would say in Barbados, a lot of long talk, a lot of long words in the title. But what we've really come here to talk about this afternoon is justice, fair play, and solidarity. People who don't normally have the power on their own, working together and making that difference. Doing so in the context of calling upon us to summon that will for moral strategic leadership in really what will become not just the battle of our lifetime, but the battle of planet Earth. My friends, I must tell you that I come here today not as a singular Caribbean person dropping from the sky, but as one who comes after the efforts of many across the decades. And it may be useful for me to place context to that struggle to make 2 points before I get into the meat of what I want to speak with you. And that is to be able to contextualize that in my own country, from the father of democracy, Grantley Herbert Adams, in his early days, both as Premier of Barbados and then as Prime Minister of the West Indies Federation, and to those countries who took action in 1959, July, after the All-Africa December 1958 Congress in Accra, Ghana, where Barbados, Jamaica, Grenada and Dominica took action to ban South African goods in solidarity with the people of South Africa. Recognizing that though there were thousands of miles away, there was an injustice being perpetrated, man's inhumanity to man, that required people who had little power to take a stand and to say, wrong is wrong. And their efforts were soon followed months later in April of 1960 in our sister island in Trinidad and Tobago, where the dock workers of Trinidad refused to take the cargo from South Africa off the ships in April of 1960 and refused to refuel the ship that had brought the cargo, recognizing that even though they were dock workers and not capable of great and grave decisions, they could do what they could within the space that they could. And their work was to be followed then, of course, by that titan of Caribbean revolution and social reform, Fidel Castro, El Comandante, who worked then with that other great Caribbean titan, Michael Manley of Jamaica, well known perhaps to many of you. And of course our own father of independence, Errol Walton Barrow, who worked with Fidel Castro in the struggle for the liberation of the peoples of Southern Africa by allowing the planes that left Havana, Cuba, to refuel in Bridgetown, Barbados, in order to bring the troops into Southern Africa, and in particular, Southwestern Africa. And then, of course, there was the decision of the Commonwealth heads of government. And I remember as a young law student in London, caught up in the fervor of the anti-apartheid movement and caught up in the passion of wanting to see your own imagery on television, because in those days you just didn't. And when we saw the students of South Africa week after week rise up to take their future into their own hands, it placed the pressure on leaders like Margaret Thatcher and others, such that by the time the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting went to Nassau, Bahamas, a determination was made to establish the Eminent Persons Group. And in that Eminent Persons Group, co-chaired by Malcolm Fraser of Australia and Chief Obasanjo of Nigeria, it also included a woman who was to become the first Governor General of Barbados, Dame Nita Barrow, who came here as one of the 7 persons to determine whether there could be a platform for talks and for release in order to ensure that the ungodly and unconscionable actions of apartheid could be brought to an end. Regrettably, their work was to be stymied by the then government, but they were capable and able at the time to meet Madiba. And it is instructive what they wrote in their unanimous report about Madiba in 1986, and I quote, "Having visited him on 3 occasions, what was their assessment? That he impressed us as an outstandingly able and sincere person whose quality of leadership were self-evident. We found him unmarked by any trace of bitterness, despite his long imprisonment. His overriding concern was for the welfare of all races in South Africa in a just society. He longed to be allowed to contribute to the process of reconciliation." This was not post-release. This was not on the eve of release. This was still deep in the bowels of his imprisonment. And you know, I've deliberately decided to take a segue this afternoon before addressing the fundamental issues, because it is important that we contextualize the struggle and the values for those who refuse to be reminded, or who fail to be reminded, or who are not reminded, may well believe that this was as easy as dealing with the twinkle of an eye with the remediation and reparation of an awful thing. It hurt me to hear that there are some who believe that Madiba did not do enough, and perhaps worse for a few, that he might have been a sellout. All because what they believe, justifiably so, should be theirs today is not yet theirs. I've deliberately started this conversation this evening by carrying you back to the 1950s and stopping in the 1980s and stopping again in the 1990s. Because if there is any one single truth, it is that each of us runs our leg of the relay. And the baton is all that can be required of us to carry. And yesterday I had the distinct honor of going to the Foundation's headquarters in the Center of Memory, and of reading, and I feel so privileged to be given copies of the transcript in Madiba's own handwriting, and I shall treasure them as long as I have breath. But in reading his own assessment of where he was and what he believed had happened in what was to become the beginning of chapter 1 of the presidential years. It was ironic that he started with the words, "Men and women all over the world, right down the centuries, come and go." Men and women all over the world, right down the centuries, come and go. What is more significant for me is that as he ended that first chapter, he also reflected on the fact that he sought at no stage for the fame that was to follow him, and that the notion that he could be regarded as a saint was one that he thoroughly rejected. And the last words, "I never was one even on the basis of an earthly definition of a saint as a sinner who keeps trying." My friends, we need to pause sometimes and to remember context always. And I do so because in a very real sense, that which I've come to address you today on too is the subject of a great struggle, and will be the subject of a struggle that will require many different people to run their different legs of the baton, of the race, to hand over the baton. And the example of Madiba is the example more than any other that I would want us to hold on to, because in so doing, it is the values that he exhibited, the moral example, the moral compass that he provides, that gives us both the strength and the capacity to run this race, which will be the greatest race that humanity will require of any generation. It stands out for me that at the very outset, courage was never lacking. It is a cause for which I am prepared to fight, but a cause for which I am prepared to die. How many of us can say that today? It was the moral fortitude of a man that determined that no type of offer with special conditionalities for early freedom would be acceptable, because what was required was justice. It is amazing that in the face of the gravest and greatest inhumanity, not just to himself, to his family, to his people, that the vengeance that would otherwise eat and force others into action was absent from his mind, body, and spirit. And as I just read to you from the evidence of the Eminent Persons Group, not conveniently so as an act of politics, but as an act of character, deep in the bosom of his imprisonment. And then there's the story that was told to me yesterday by Cello, as we looked at the photographs of what his cell contained. And I well recall my own visit to Robben Island 20 years ago. And all who, like me, have practiced a little criminal law in my career know that that is a common sight in colonial constructed prisons that had no sanitary facilities. and the humility of the man captured best in being able to ensure that when one of his own brothers was unable to take care of themselves in the most basic and human of ways, that Madiba performed the duties of cleaning for him. An example of servant leadership, if ever there is one. So forgive me if I have strayed a bit, because I believe that in this world where everything is instantaneous and quick, and where people expect results like that, we sometimes need to remind ourselves of the context of the struggles that we fight, and to remind ourselves of what truly was at stake. There are some young people who would simply now, 3 decades after his release, will only know of Nelson Mandela in the context of a history book or in the stories told by others, but would not appreciate what it is to be prevented from being able to love who you want, to work where you want, to live where you want, to do what you want, in ways that are simply not capable of contemplation today. But we can't talk about economic justice and economic opportunity if the basic aspects of freedom have not been guaranteed. No one expects us to be stuck in a moment of time, but it is the understanding that he did what was his to do. It is now up to us to do what is ours to do. And it is for that reason I've come to KwaZulu-Natal. You know, we live in a world that is at a very strange moment in time. It has been described recently as a polycrisis. And it has been so described because as soon as you get accustomed to managing one crisis, you've been hit with another one and another one and another one. And that is what it has felt like in the last few years. This country already knows what it is to lose people to the ravages of a public health crisis, as you did with HIV and AIDS for so long. Then to have to face, like the rest of us, the awful pandemic of COVID-19, taking away so many. All of us know people who have died in the last few years. None of us dreamt of a moment when our movement would be restricted such that we couldn't do the things that we wanted to do. And this was not being imposed on us by authoritarian governments. This was being imposed by public health specialists for the safety and survival of all of us. And as if that were not enough, because we were already fighting the climate crisis, we were still recovering from the financial crisis of 2008-9. As if all of that was not enough, then comes the awful scourge of the cancer of inflation, the cancer of the cost of living. And believe you me, it is a cancer, because you keep trying to run after it and run after it, but you can't catch up with it in that way. And we have now to come to understand that as much as we needed to mobilize to fight against vaccine inequity, that we were not a one-issue country or a one-issue people, that we literally had to fight these multiple crises, because as all of this is happening, people were still dying from the climate crisis. I don't talk about the climate change. Change happened a long time ago. Crisis is where we are, and crisis is what we have to fight. And today, I want us to recognize that what is required of us is going to have to allow us to, one, develop partnerships in places where we may never have dreamt of so doing before, and to be able to do things in new ways that we had never thought of doing, and that the actions required are not simply those of others, but of us, because it is the collective action that has led the world to be where it is today. There is no doubt that those primarily responsible for the increase in greenhouse gas emissions are the G20 countries, for whom 80% of the responsibility is there. Within that context, the traditional colonial powers who benefited from the Industrial Revolution through our blood, our sweat, and our tears, have been the ones who have effectively put the world in this position of warming. Theirs is the stock of gases. But then there are those who continue today, for which there are many of us. No name, no blame, because it's all of us. And it is the combined effect of the stock, primarily, but yes, the flow today, that continues to cause the problems. I want us to reflect on the principles of justice and solidarity, and on the moral compass that Madiba provided for us, to understand that what is required of us is to be able to deconstruct and to reconstruct much of what we do. We have come to a stage where the evidence of the science is palpable. I didn't know when I accepted to do this speech that you, the people of KwaZulu-Natal, would have, in this week of our Lord this year, suffered additional damage. The second river breaking its banks in less than 6 months. The first one causing loss of life and damage. This one continuing the loss of damage. We speak in the shadow of Sharm el-Sheikh, a conference of the parties intended to see progress and action. Progress, I fear, not fast enough, but still yet there. But it is up to ordinary people to begin to place the pressure and to begin to participate in the advocacy that is going to make the difference. And why? The consequences of the climate are now multidimensional, of this crisis. I spoke just now of the loss of life. I could easily speak about the loss of livelihood. I can speak equally of the loss of dignity, the loss of shelter, the loss of family, the loss of culture, the increased number of climate migrants that we will see moving across this earth. You know, it really hit me when a former governor of the Nigerian Central Bank said to me that 80% of southwest Nigeria is above the poverty line, and 80% of northwest Nigeria is below the poverty line. And then you start to look at the realities of what people face on this continent and what people face in the islands of the Caribbean Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Sea. And we begin to understand that what is at stake now is real for people. Nobody believed that the people of Montserrat would ever have to leave their island because of a volcanic eruption. And the notion that climate refugees is something for others somewhere else is now proven to be a fiction. It is real and it is with us. And you here in this province have seen evidence of it this week. And in my own region last weekend in St. Lucia, the people of St. Lucia felt the ravages of the floods there, not the hurricane, the floods. In Belize City, a few days before, it was the hurricane. How many more hurricanes? How many more floods? How many more people suffering from drought as is happening in Kenya? Will the world endure and have to endure before action is taken? The difficulty is, and this is where the complexity of the conversation enters, is that it is not simply the commitments made on stage now that matter, but it is the capacity to deliver on those commitments. In my own country, we have recognized that we needed to do our part. And I have repeated over and over that in making those determinations, we said, use electric cars, we'll give you a tax holiday. 2 years, we can't get the electric cars to buy. We've said, let every owner of their own house be entitled to have, as of right, photovoltaic panels, 2.5, 5, 10 kilowatts, depending on the size of the house. Can't get the batteries to deal with the storage necessary to allow these persons to do it. And that is why this week in Sharm el-Sheikh I called not just simply for capacity to match commitment, but also for us to ensure that we have a just industrialization. You see, the global south has for too long been the place from which wealth has been extracted and for which there has been no determination to put back into the south the resources necessary to move from primary materials to finished product. And if you're like us in the Caribbean, where you're small, you are not only price takers, you have to hope you can get access to the product. The pandemic taught us that with vaccines, with ventilators, with other therapeutics, because you're just too small to anyone to notice you. And once there is global pressure on, there will be winners and losers, and small states count among the losers in those circumstances. Regrettably, we have come to a point where the necessary capacity to make the just transition, a phrase that you know well here in South Africa, the just energy transition, is no longer within our power alone. And it therefore means that we are likely to see more innocent victims, because the reality between our capacity to manage that transition and to see it happen is just simply not there. I hope that with the granular discussions taking place that we can see more activity. But the reality equally is this, that it costs money to bring about industrialization. And even when the global north seems to want to help us in the south, the cost of so doing has been made so prohibitive by an unfair financial system that it is almost impossible to achieve with the level of returns that are acceptable. And you know this better than I do in South Africa. In the global north, people will borrow at anywhere between 1 to 4%. In the south, you're struggling 12 and 14% in today's environment. When those costs are put into the business plan, the rates of return from the project all of a sudden just don't look attractive enough. And you ask yourself, why is there that disparity in the cost of borrowing? Why is there that disparity in the treatment of our peoples? Why is it that during the emerging market crisis, the international financial institutions promoted a constant prescription of currency devaluation and higher interest rates and fiscal austerity and an end to public bailouts? And there were sharp contractions and increases in poverty we saw in the nations who were so affected. But when their countries became the subject of the crisis, all of a sudden the prescription was different. No devaluation, zero interest rates, fiscal expansion, massive bailouts. You only need to recall what happened in 2008. You don't have to go much further. In fact, the fact that we are seeing interest rates rise from zero tells you and reminds you of where it went because of the last crisis. The disparity in treatment, regrettably, is one of the remaining consequences of the colonial order. And we in the South have to determine whether we will continue to be victims of a process that was supposed to have been dismantled in the post-World War II era, with your own country coming almost 50 years after because of the apartheid system. It is simply not good enough. And we have, therefore, to change the discourse, not just to climate alone, but to the financial system that is underpinning and preventing us from being architects and craftsmen of our own destiny, rather than simply awaiting the handouts from others in the global north. You know, I would much rather that I could be here talking other things today, because then we would have a fuller conversation. But the truth is that it is that injustice and that discriminatory treatment at the core of the financial system, in my view, that continues to limit the promise of political independence and decolonization that was promised to us. Those who expect more of Madiba expect more because their own personal, financial, and economic circumstances have not moved with the pace that they might otherwise have accepted or expected. And it is for that reason that I believe that if ever there was a moment in time for the global South to rally around a cause, it is now. There are at least 50 countries who stand on the verge of a debt crisis as we speak today. It does not give me any comfort to say that the worst may yet still be before us. And I say so because one of the things that is necessary for those same younger people who wonder about Madiba's role is that the first thing we need to do is to moderate expectations and to bring context and reality to all that we do in today's world in this moment of a polycrisis. I spoke already about the inflation. I have not yet spoken, but perhaps should, about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is just simply our desire to have a better life. And those are being frozen as the numbers who are going back into poverty increase, as the numbers who face food insecurity increase. And at the core of it, I submit to you, are a few things that we need to do differently. One, yes, the reform of the financial system, and I'll come back to that in what we call the Bridgetown Initiative. But two, I want to speak to us, because we need to treat to government and governance differently. And we need to appreciate that if we treated to the pandemic purely as a government solution, most of us probably would never have succeeded. But it was the national effort to fight those battles that have allowed us to come out today in far better shape than we were and that we were expected to be in when we went in. And the partnerships now between citizen, community, and country, the ability for those of us who are above the poverty line to give back and to give of ourselves in the spirit of Madiba. To recognize that it is not to government alone that this charge must fall, and that our ability to help people through the cost of living crisis is within our capacity, in a way that the climate crisis is not immediately within our capacity. But we need to be strong to fight the climate crisis. And if we don't fight the cost of living crisis as we fought the pandemic, we will be that much weaker in being able to emerge successful and resilient from the climate crisis. I ask us to ponder on these things because too often in today's world there is the determination that let us look to someone else and look at someone else for the solution. When in truth and in fact, our capacity and capability of working together can make the difference between whether someone sleeps easy at night, whether someone eats during the day, whether someone has access to shelter. And I do hope that when combined, yes, with the monetary measures that must be put in place, quantitative tightening, increasing interest rates, suppressing demand, bringing about hardship in order to be able to make the patient better. Where I come from, I don't know whether you had a cough medicine here called Buckley's, but we had one in Barbados called Buckley's. It tastes bad, but it works. And that was what your parents would tell you every day. It tastes bad, but it works. And regrettably, to control the cancer of cost of living, it is going to require some suppression of what we do in order to tame the prices back down so that your salaries don't evaporate in the air. But these conversations cannot be captured in 60-second sound bites or 4-inch columns. And therefore, we inhibit ourselves from being able to be successful in solving these problems because we don't have the difficult conversations with each other globally anymore, because we are into a world of narrowcasting, we're into a world of social media, we are into a world where we do our own thing in our own way when we want, without reference to whether that will allow us to sustain the journey. Could you imagine if that was the approach of Madiba, where you would be standing in South Africa today? Could you imagine if that were the approach of those others who fought, like Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo and all of the others? Where would you be today? But even when we get rid of that cost of living issue, the other reason why we need to reform the financial system is because we actually do need money to invest in human development. We're not a one crisis or a one issue person. Even if we think we're only doing it for climate, the reality is, as I said in Sharm el-Sheikh this week, we cannot depend on the financing of education and healthcare with 7-year money and 10-year money anymore, because it simply will not allow us to provide the best possible education to our children, who, quite frankly, deserve it. And if there was anything that I could wish for globally, it would be a global minimum floor for the provision of education and health care to all citizens under the age of 18 years old. That's why we are human beings. We don't come on this earth just to individually prosper and see others suffer. And you here know it more than most because of your struggles. And if we can therefore ensure that if we can borrow at reasonable rates of interest, the savings in the interest will finance many of the social programs that now go lacking in our societies because of an unfair financial system. I'm not talking about yesterday, when the debt crisis has gotten worse, but 2 years ago, Greece and Ghana, same credit rating, but Greece borrowing at a fraction of what the government of Ghana could borrow on the international capital markets. For what reason? Because one is in Africa and one is in Europe? Geography? I do know about the safe assets, yes. But the safe assets are a construct of the international financial architecture that does not see us, does not hear us, and does not feel us. And that is why we have asked more and over that if you can, one, meet the immediate needs of the crisis by providing liquidity to those countries that most need it, to allow them to stop the bleeding. That's effectively what they're doing, stopping the bleeding. You can't operate on the patient while the patient is bleeding out. And thank God, the International Monetary Fund has the leadership that it does today, because without Kristalina Georgieva's leadership, God knows what would have happened to so many countries if the rapid credit facility had not been there in 2020 when the pandemic first started. But the problem is that that was for the pandemic starting. And I described a polycrisis, which means that the need for additional liquidity is still there. And it begs the question whether there ought not to be a different approach to these issues, allowing, for example, a standard liquidity drawdown that will immediately stop the bleeding without questions, without conditionalities, because if the bleeding continues, the financial crisis will eat in to our pockets, our bank accounts, our savings, our stability. That is what is at risk. And that is what happened 100 years ago with the Great Depression. And God forbid that it should be our future and not just simply an example of our history. Similarly, we believe that it is important that the multilateral development banks and the World Bank, otherwise known as its proper name, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, needs to exercise greater risk appetite and to step up to the plate where it has not been sufficiently found during this polycrisis moment. Our countries cannot do it alone. And I don't say so with any rancid tone in my voice. I say so more as a plea now at this stage. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development of the 20th century, with the crises of the 20th century, cannot be the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development of the third decade of the 21st century, when the crises are different. You may ask why I'm spending so much time on these issues. Because these are the issues that will determine whether we can provide more financing for education to ensure that we can reduce the level of crime in our societies. Whether we can provide more financing so that we can provide health care to those who truly deserve it, and who therefore can boost their immune systems such that they are not vulnerable to the next pandemic whenever it comes, unnecessarily so. As we learned with the last pandemic, that it was the comorbidities that took out the weakest from among us. These are the unsexy things that some may have wanted Madiba to solve in 5 years, but require us to solve in a few decades. And then there's the other unsexy issue of special drawing rights. Because when we ask the multilateral development banks to expand their lending to us at concessional rates, we realize that, yes, they can, as the capital adequacy framework recommends from the G20 countries, they can sweat their balance sheets a little more. But in addition to that, they probably will need the benefit of the special drawing rights to be able to expand their lending significantly as well. And as they do that, we ask them to remember that 70% of the world's poor do not live actually in low-income countries. They don't live in poor countries. 70% of the world's poor live in middle-income countries. And when you exclude middle-income countries from being able to borrow, you are effectively condemning the poor in middle-income countries to remain in poverty for the rest of their lives and to cement in intergenerational poverty. That is what we fight for. The notion that Barbados, Bahamas, and the Maldives cannot borrow as a right from the World Bank in today's world in a climate crisis is so preposterous that it tells us that we need to reset and recalibrate urgently if we are to prepare for fighting these battles. My friends, you know, those last two things or three things that I spoke about are part of the Bridgetown Initiative. I've tried to break them down into simple terms because it is important that the energy comes from you as well to be able to say that this is a battle that must be won. Apartheid remained when it was the province of those in diplomatic arena and politically charged rooms, cloistered, even the UN. But when the children of this country determined that they were not going to be those guinea pigs to be forced into the language of Afrikaans and took their future into their own hands and had a level of militancy that said not another generation, the battle changed and the conversation changed. The climate crisis is no different. And if we are to ensure that these same children and their children and their children are to live appropriately in today's world, then it is critical that this battle now be embraced at different levels. I can't imagine it would have been easy for Madiba to learn Afrikaans, either emotionally or technically. But he did it. Because in mastering the language and mastering the understanding of the culture, he was able to navigate his way out of 28 years of imprisonment. I can't imagine that it is sexy for me to talk about financial reform on a Saturday afternoon in Durban when I should perhaps be out there next to the beach like the rest of the people I saw out there enjoying themselves. But if we are going to win this battle, then you need to learn what special drawing rights are. And you need to understand why it is that people in the South borrowing at rates of interest that are much, much higher than the people in the North. And you need to understand why the policy prescriptions for countries in the North, when they face financial crises, are different from the countries in the South. And you need to ask yourselves, what is the common thread? Especially at a time when many refuse, even in the North, to acknowledge the reality of the climate crisis. It is frightening, to say the least. And that is why, even in the Bridgetown Initiative, when we talk about mitigation, we understand that as a small country, we don't have a lot of space in the Caribbean or in Barbados or in the wider Caribbean to mitigate. You have considerably more here in South Africa, in the continent of Africa. But our belief is that mitigation, wherever it takes place on this earth, is necessary. And that mitigation, yes, can be driven by the private sector. And yes, mitigation will more attract the language of capitalists who see returns, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we must encourage mitigation. But what we say is that the mitigation ought to be something where we create a special climate mitigation trust, invest it with $5 trillion coming out once again of the SDRs, but allowing projects to bid from wherever they are on this earth, from here in KwaZulu-Natal to wherever else, to be able to help bring down the changes and the impact of the greenhouse gases. Because mitigation is valid and relevant wherever it takes place on the earth. And therefore there should be no geographical limitations to where mitigation can take place. Now, we can't be fairer than that, because we're not asking purely that the money come to us for mitigation. We're saying do it wherever. But what must happen is that you must do it. And regrettably, what we are still getting is the standoff. And the standoff comes because mankind is so consumed with the geopolitics of today's world that we are forgetting the reality of the planet on which we live. And it is sad, because at the end of the day, time waits on no one. And the climate equally is not waiting on anyone to minimize its impact on our living and our way of life. The reality also is that justice demands that someone pay, particularly when countries who have no capacity to pay, no fiscal space, no balance sheet, cannot do so. And that is the big debate that now stands before us. Earlier this week, you may have heard me say that it is a major achievement that loss and damage has gotten finally on the agenda for conversation. Not that we've resolved it, not that we've settled the mechanism for it, but it is at least on the agenda. And I say so because it took Denmark in September, and subsequently Scotland, New Zealand and Belgium in the last 2 weeks, however modest, establishing loss and damage funds to begin to say to the rest of the North Atlantic world that this is an issue, this is a conversation whose time has come. And I want to put it very simply to you. Trevor, if I lived next door to you, and every day I am dumping on your property, and the money that you had to send to school your children, or to pay for medical care for your wife, all of a sudden now has to be taken up to clean up the property because you can't sleep at night, you can't eat food in peace, then you would say that I should be sued, and that I must stand responsibility for the fact that I'm causing you to spend the majority of your earnings on being able just to live. Well, private law acknowledges it, and technically international public policy acknowledges polluter pays. But there is a fear of the developed world, the former industrial economies, I shouldn't say in the former, the industrial economies, the former colonizing powers, who knew how they got there, to accept liability, because they believe that in accepting liability it will be open-ended. Well, as a former Attorney General, I say we don't ask you for open-ended liability. But what we do ask you for is justice. And what we do ask you for is to recognize that we too accept, as reasonable people, that this is not a matter purely for the government or the state, but that there are non-state actors, multinational corporations whose balance sheets far exceed that of many countries in the world, and whose balance sheets get there by reason of the same pollution, who have a responsibility to pay. And I'm not into the bashing or bashing. That's not what I'm about. But the Bible talks to us about tithing, and the Quran speaks to us about giving back to those. And we simply say that if you are going to make 100 cents in profit, $200 billion in the last quarter alone, some estimates explain that they may even reach $2 trillion in 1 year in profits. Profits. Then you have a responsibility to put something on the table in a loss and damage fund for those who are now having to pay out. And the oil and gas companies are not there by themselves, because those who stand behind them will be the banking and the financial industry and financial sector and the insurance companies, who equally profit in the same way. Now, I'm using this as an example, as I've said over and over, because the world is reaching a point where global public goods is going to become the most important conversation, even as we fight this climate crisis. That is what the polycrisis moment has taught us. The pandemic. If we thought COVID-19 was bad, well, I'm here to tell you as co-chair of the Global Health Initiative that the antimicrobial resistance, the reality of your going to a doctor or dentist for filling of a cavity, or going to have a baby, that you are at risk of infection that could kill you now if your body no longer responds to the antibiotics, because there is a resistance that has naturally been built up, and the pharmaceutical industry has not brought a new antibiotic to the market in 22 years. Fact, fact, fact. Why? Because the economics of antibiotics don't compare to the economics of pharmaceuticals that treat heart condition or diabetes, because you need those for life and you only need the antibiotics for a course. The economics just don't work. These are the realities and the global commons that we need in order to sustain life and livelihood and quality of life for our people. Will require a different approach. And therefore, the notion of non-state actors, predominantly companies, whether oil and gas, whether banking and finance, whether pharmaceutical, whether tech companies bridging the digital divide for education for young children, all have now to step up to the plate to provide a global fund that allows those countries who can no longer access it but through lack of fairness and lack of equity at the international level, in the same way that you knew during apartheid in your own years. It is regrettably a deeply colonial, segmented system. Some may even argue it is global apartheid. And who best to provide the example of moral, strategic leadership for us to win this battle than Madiba? I say to you today that we have a solemn duty, not just to look at governments, not just to look at multinational corporations, but also to bring to the table those who have large philanthropic foundations, and for whom there ought now to be some form of global compact that allows them also. Many of them are doing it on their own, but perhaps we need more structure to ensure that there is a blended approach to the provision of a safe global commons for all of our people on this earth to function and to live in harmony. We are not going to get there by the twiddle of a nose. We're not going to get there in a beam me up Scotty moment, as I love to say. But it is going to require the mobilization of people like yourselves. And it is to happen at a time when much else that we have come to value as standards are also being questioned. No one would ever have thought that the United States of America would take days to count votes in an election. No one would ever have thought that the United Kingdom would have had 3 prime ministers in less than 3 months. And regrettably, none of us would have ever dreamt to see war in Europe after World War II again, so soon and so tragically. Mind you, it is almost as if they've forgotten that war existed in Africa and in the Middle East for decades. The world that we have come to know has changed upon us. And we will either decide, as people of the South, to be firm craftsmen of our fate and shapers of our destiny, or we will continue to be the victims as we have been for centuries. I would much rather have come here this afternoon to speak in the tone and with the response that a Trevor Noah would be able to do on a Saturday afternoon in Durban. But regrettably, that is not my lot today. But suffice it to say that we have now to do the heavy lifting of educating our people at all levels of society and across all countries for a global movement whose time has come. It is up to us to make the bold demands, just as Madiba did. Not unreasonable demands, in the same way that he restrained himself from unreasonable demands. It is up to us to also walk the higher road, because those who have been the victims of discrimination must not allow themselves to be imprisoned by the actions of those who sought to discriminate before, because that is a lonely and awful place to be. But what it does require of us is a fair and level playing field. And whether it is the reform of the financial system, whether it is the call for a just industrialization of the South to position us to benefit as we transition how we live and what we want to hold on to in this climate crisis, whether it is the practicality of the moment, and forgive me if I address this for a minute, because for many there is not a recognition that a just energy transition and a 2050 net zero still accommodates elements of fossil fuel, 20% of the energy mix globally. Natural gas, the clean bridge fuel, the hydrogen, but it does mean walking away from coal, and it does mean walking away from oil. But there are opportunities for natural gas, and there are opportunities for hydrogen. And perhaps the opportunities for natural gas may even be a little too much for a little too long, only because of the intransigence and the reluctance of others to move with the rapidity of speed that has been needed in the last decade. But the reality equally is that we cannot turn off the lights on our people tomorrow purely in the issue, on the basis that we are doing the right thing, because people must live and people must. That contextualization also needs to be there before people say, no gas at all either. We don't have that luxury in today's world anymore. And we lost the right to claim that luxury by governments that failed to move in the last 2 decades. So my friends, how do we redefine the spirit of Madiba? How do we redefine, in my own country, what we have come to call sharing the burden, but sharing the bounty? That we must all come together to fight the cause and share the burden, but remember that when the bounty is to be shared, that it is all who must share in it. That the patrimony that is ours through the sea, through the wind, through the sun, has been left to us not for a few, but for all. How do we create the intergenerational responsibilities that allow us to know that it is not one generation or one man or one group of people to run the race and to leave it as if that is the end of the race. I'm reminded of the words of the Talmud, which says, we are not expected to complete the task, but neither are we at liberty to resile from it. Ours is now the moment for the construction of a new global deal and a new social compact, as Antonio Guterres said to you when he addressed you on the 18th lecture in 2020. But for it to be real, it requires the energy and the activism that Barack Obama spoke of in his lecture in the 16th. And for it to be real, it requires the example, not just of Madiba, but of the people of South Africa, who rose after decades of oppression and who understood that they were fighting for their culture, for their land, for their people, and who understood that if they allowed themselves to be dominated by a new and foreign culture, that what would be left of them would be so little, and that it might take centuries to recreate. Today, it is up to us to recognize simply that if we don't move now, that what will be left of our planet will be inhabitable not for us. The majority of us will make it. Regrettably, some will go. But it is your children and your children's children who will now have to find, in many places, new places to live. I hope and pray that we will take the example of Madiba and the people of South Africa in understanding what is required to win mighty battles that are necessary for good harmony with the planet and with people. And in spite of all of the odds showed to them, and all of the odds showed now to us, we can do it simply if we try. The words of Black Stalin, a Trinidadian Calypsonian. But ironically, I want to leave you with another phrase, because something tells me that the spirit of the world has been awakened and that everything will be all right. Thank you.
If I ask them to applaud again, they will repeat it. Prime Minister, believe you me if I tell you this is the longest applause we've had at the Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture. And I'm saying it not because we are in KZN and I want to be safe, but it's true. I can tell you you are dearly loved because as you said, I want to see you. They said, oh wow, did you hear that? So that's how much you are loved. But I was looking at some of the comments that we got. Someone said, can't she be our president just for a month? Another commentator said she's extraordinary. Malibongwe. Malibongwe. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Wherever Madiba is, wherever Fidel Castro is, wherever Bob Marley is, they are all looking at you and they are super proud. I use those three names because when we met the Prime Minister, she said she has three heroes. It's Madiba, Fidel Castro, and Bob Marley. So the baton will be handed over, Prime Minister, and I'm reminded of what Madiba said in 2008 when he said, the world remains beset by so much human suffering, poverty, and disease. It is in your hands to help build a different world. So the baton has been handed over, and we heard you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I want to now invite Mrs. Graça Machel to come forward and offer us both a short response and a reflection, closing remarks, as it were. Ms. Graça needs a little introduction to either local or global communities or audiences. She's a tireless activist for the rights of women and children, has taken leadership positions for many years, both locally and internationally, and walked hand in hand with Madiba in the last phase of his life's long walk. She has supported the annual lecture faithfully year after year since inception. And whenever I say to her, thank you, Mom, she says, that's my obligation, Mom.
Wow, this was really the lecture of the 20th time. Mia, welcome home. Welcome home. It would have taken to be a daughter of Africa, as you quite rightly defined yourself when you were delivering the inaugural lecture to Kofi Annan. Yes, our ancestors crossed the ocean where now you reside. You came home at the right time. Absolutely the right time. You talked about crisis, many crises, which I don't want to repeat because I don't want to dilute. There's one crisis which you didn't mention out of humility. It's the crisis of leadership. Globally, I'm talking of crisis of leadership globally. I'm so proud that it has to be an African child, a woman, leading what you would say is a small country, as if countries are measured according to the numbers of people or according to the dimension of its territory. But I think it's symbolic. It is an African child, a woman from a tiny country who in this global crisis of leadership, she rises. She rises. And she talks to the global community, to the human family, and say, yes, there is a crisis, or there are many crises, but I'm here. I'm ready to lead and to tell the truth to all of us. Mia, you spoke to us. I want to start with us. You spoke to us, and you reignite our agency, our responsibility for our own future. It's not anyone else who's going to build it for us. And you reminded us that yes, as it sounded impossible to dismantle apartheid, it is these people and it is these Africans, it is the global South, then it's the global family which were able to do it. Now you are telling us, yes, we have a leader. If many of us had a doubt, we have a leader. She is our own, but she is global. So, we want to thank you because you remind us of our own strengths. But we want to thank you and to tell you that from here, yes, take the bold leadership, the courage, the deep sense of justice, the ability to make complex issues, but to make them very palpable to ordinary citizens, as we were able to listen this afternoon. Take this leadership. You were talking about the baton to us, but you came to take the baton from Ngube, from Madiba. Yes, you'll be much more emboldened to know you carry them with you as you have to lead the global South first, to be able to claim its space, its rights, but also to claim that it takes us to liberate even those who are our oppressors. So, it is symbolic that you would have to come here, educate us. But it's symbolic that you came to take even more strength, and I can't even talk about your brilliance of your mind, but to be emboldened to say these struggles of this 21st century has the Madibas, but the Madibas are in the face of a woman and in the voice of a woman. Yes, I'm speaking also to many girls sitting here in front of us. This sister of yours is telling that, yes, part of the leadership which is lacking, it is a female leadership. Female leadership. And take it from me as your mother. Yes, the liberation struggle has the symbols, the bigger symbols, which come now are made. And this one, this second liberation in which we go to, we need much more female faces and voices. Stand up. Be counted. Why? Because it takes the combination of the mind and the heart to articulate difficult issues, but then to make it sound so clear to everyone. We need many more Mias. And you have to stand and be counted. I want to sit down because my point was not to make comments to the brilliant, brilliant lecture you have given. I decided I want to really pay tribute to you as an African and to Africans. I said I needed to emphasize that no one is small, is too small to lead. And to say in that leadership, you need to count in every single one of us as we did it in the past, and then to articulate, to make such movements that everyone will have to be shaken and everyone will have to transform. Everyone has to accept, yes, there is a possibility. And that possibility, she articulated very, very clearly. So, hello, South Africa. Hello, Africa. Hello, Global South. It's time for Global South to lead. Hello. The Northern South, it's time to listen. And hello, human family. We only have one planet. We don't have two. And we have the ability to save it. And we were told how we can do it. Yes. Thank you, I usually say, thank you, my baby girl. Thank you, my baby girl. You make us so proud. But be sure, you have many of us as your soldiers. We'll be behind you. We'll learn the lessons. We'll articulate it as you do, as at our level, of course. But yes, we took the message, we listened. Yes, we will be at your side or even behind you, because this is exactly the second generation of liberation we are going to. The decolonization she talked about. This new and one liberation which needs now every one of us to take responsibility and to accept another saying of Madiba. It sounds impossible. Thank you.
So what you didn't hear is how Mama Shell said, wena. You know, when an elder says wena, you know you're in trouble. So I'm not going to say much, just to thank you.
All right, there you have it, the 20th annual Nelson Mandela Lecture delivered by Mia Amor Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. And my goodness, I was sitting here in studio. I don't know how you received it at home, but for me, it seems she laid out a set of dynamite charges, intellectual dynamite charges, and then she set them off. She absolutely set them off. I felt I was challenged and edified intellectually from that 20th lecture. What didn't come up? I mean, you have the theme talking about the Global South and its responsibility and approach to the crisis of climate change, and then she just flips it. She flipped it altogether and brought in dynamics that have to do with the need for reform of the global financial system, linking that to the climate crisis, but also to other issues of development that affect the Global South. I felt it really touched and hit all the right notes, that speech there by Prime Minister Mia Amor Mottley, hence that standing ovation and the applause that she received. It will be difficult really for me to even recap among the issues that she talked about, but she did talk about the moment for the Global South to rally around one agenda, a common agenda. That moment is now in the light of all the crises that we have seen over the last few years. And then she talked about that financial system, the global financial system, which she says continues to limit the promise of liberation and decolonization in the Global South, and talking about how many countries face a debt crisis at the moment, and therefore calling for everyone in the Global South to stand up for and champion the need for reforms in as far as the global financial system. Basically saying that institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF cannot continue to hold to solutions of the 20th century when 21st century problems have arisen. My goodness, you will have to listen to it again for yourself and see what you take out of that. But I'm sitting here, I was sitting on the edge of my seat being challenged in as far as that speech is concerned. A fitting speech to be delivered on the 20th annual Nelson Mandela Lecture.